Alright, well, up to this point, like in the first chapter, Lewis just described what the book was going to be about. And in the second chapter, he defined terms. What do we mean by nature? What do we mean by supernature? In the third chapter, he went into why he feels the naturalist argument is flawed. Right. So, what's the biggest problem with naturalism? What's the hurdle that it just can't get over? In this chapter, he wants to describe how if there's this problem with nature, this flaw that, if there's this problem with naturalism, this flaw that it can't deal with, it can't resolve, then how is it that a universe could exist where nature and supernature could intermingle? How is it that they could cross over each other? Aren't they in conflict? Aren't they at odds with each other? And how could that conflict be resolved? So that's what this chapter is about. That's why its title is Nature and Supernature. It starts with a quote by R.G. Collingwood from The Idea of Nature. Throughout the long tradition of European thought, it has been said, not by everyone, but by most people, or at any rate by most of those who have proved that they have a right to be heard, that nature, though it is a thing that really exists, is not a thing that exists in itself, or in its own right, but a thing which depends for its existence upon something else. So Lewis begins here, if our argument has been sound, acts of reasoning are not interlocked with the total interlocking system of nature, as all its other items are interlocked with one another. They are interconnected with it in a different way, as the understanding of a machine is certainly connected with the machine, but not in the way the parts of the machine are connected with each other. The knowledge of a thing is not one of the thing's parts. In this sense, something beyond nature operates whenever we reason. I am not maintaining that consciousness as a whole must necessarily be put in the same position. Pleasures, pains, fears, hopes, affections, and mental images need not. No absurdity would follow from regarding them as parts of nature. The distinction we have to make is not one between mind and matter, much less between soul and body, hard words, all four of them, but between reason and nature. Frontier coming not where the outer world ends, and what I should ordinarily call myself begins, but between reason and the whole mass of non-rational events, whether physical or psychological. At that frontier, we find a great deal of traffic, but it is all one-way traffic. It is a matter of daily experience that rational thoughts induce and enable us to alter the course of nature, of physical nature when we use mathematics to build bridges, or of psychological nature when we apply arguments to alter our own emotions. We succeed in modifying physical nature often more and more completely than we succeed in modifying psychological nature. But we do at least a little to both. On the other hand, nature is quite powerless to produce rational thought. Not that she never modifies our thinking, but that the moment she does so, it ceases, for that very reason, to be rational. For as we have seen, a train of thought loses all rational credentials, as soon as it can be shown to be wholly the result of non-rational causes. When nature, so to speak, attempts to do things to rational thoughts, she only succeeds in killing them. That is the peculiar state of affairs at the frontier. Nature can only raid reason to kill. But reason can invade nature to take prisoners, and even to colonize. Every object you see before you at this moment, the walls, ceiling, and furniture, the book, your own washed hands and cut fingernails, bears witness to the colonization of nature by reason. For none of this matter would have been in these states if nature had had her way. And if you are attending to my argument as closely as I hope, that attention also results from habits which reason has imposed on the natural ramblings of consciousness. If, on the other hand, a toothache or an anxiety is at this very moment preventing you from attending, then nature is indeed interfering with your consciousness. but not to produce some new variety of reasoning, only, as far as in her lies, to suspend reason altogether. So to follow the argument here, he's saying that there's a borderland between nature and reason, a place where they meet each other, and there's a lot of traffic. He says at this borderland where your reason is encountering nature, and nature is encountering your reason, but the traffic is all one-way traffic, because nature can only affect reasoning in order to destroy it. And when you put it in those terms, that nature can only affect reason in order to destroy it, it sounds like what we're talking. It sounds like what we're talking about is something esoteric or fancy, something academic. But this can be put in real practical terms, which Lewis does, to say that you could be contemplating some serious problem and looking for a solution when you stub your toe. Contemplating this while you're walking, and you stub your toe on the edge of your coffee table or your couch or something like that. Well, what happens to that train of reasoning, that flow of thought? It ceases, right? This is an example of nature invading, or not invading, but raiding reason like a barbarian army. It's coming in not to colonize. It's coming in not to take prisoners. It's coming in to destroy. Where on the other hand, the traffic in the other direction, where reason is going into nature, though it can be destructive, it is it's there to organize. It comes in to organize. It comes in to reapportion. It comes in to solve, right? So reason invades nature through things like using mathematics, in Lewis's example, to build a bridge, or to construct a road, or even to mow your lawn. These are things that you're using these are rational processes that you're using to affect nature, to go out and put a flag in nature's territory, because it establishes in nature a place that that wouldn't have been there otherwise, right? So this is that analogy he's trying to draw, sort of this border between two countries, and one can only invade to destroy, and the other can invade to colonize and take prisoners. Continuing on, Lewis says, in other words, the relation between reason and nature is what some people call an unsymmetrical relation. Brotherhood is a symmetrical relation, because if A is the brother of B, B is the brother of A. Father and son is an unsymmetrical relation, because if A is the father of B, B is not the father of A. The relation between reason and nature is of this kind. Reason is not related to nature, as nature is related to reason. I am only too well aware how shocking those who have been brought up to naturalism will find the picture which begins to show itself. It is frankly a picture in which nature, at any rate on the surface of our own planet, is perforated or pockmarked all over by little orifices, at each of which something of a different kind from herself, namely reason, can do things to her. I can only beg you, before you throw the book away, to consider seriously whether your instinctive repugnance to such a conception is really rational, or whether it is only emotional or aesthetic. I know that the hankering for a universe which is all of a piece, and in which everything is the same sort of thing as everything else, a continuity, a seamless web, a democratic universe, is very deep-seated in the modern heart, in mine no less than in yours. But have we any real assurance that things are like that? Are we mistaking for an intrinsic probability what is really a human desire for tidiness and harmony? Bacon warned us long ago that, quote, the human understanding is of its own nature prone to suppose the existence of more order and regularity in the world than it finds. And though there be many things which are singular and unmatched, yet it devises for them parallels and conjugates, and relatives which do not exist. hence the fiction that all celestial bodies move in perfect circles, end quote. I think Bacon was right. Science itself has already made reality appear less homogeneous than we could expect it to be. Newtonian atomism was much more the sort of thing we expected and desired than quantum physics. So this is not a strange concept to anybody if you think about it for very long. We look for order even when there is none. We look for patterns even when there is none. Mostly this is probably because this is what our brains are designed to do. Our brains are designed to look for order, and this is essential for our survival. But it also makes us think. It makes our thinking go awry. At times, it can do that because we look for patterns when there are none. We try to find shapes in the clouds. You know, the clouds that look like ice cream cones, or a cloud that looks like someone's face. This is our habit. It's our tendency. It's our way as humans to try to do this. And so when we look at the universe, we might think, well, everything. It might be a tendency for people to think that all of the mass of things we see in the universe need to be of the same kind. That and he's talking chiefly to the naturalists here, who would be sort of put off by the idea that nature is one continuous mass of the same things, the things that are of the same kind, but here and there are pockmarked things that are different from her, different from nature, things that can affect nature. And here he's talking about our minds, our ability to reason. That it's just sort of pockmarked, or as he said, perforated with little islands of things that are different from nature altogether. And this might be offensive, or it might be strange, or it might put off the naturalist who would prefer to see things as having a general continuity. And he says, well, are we sure that we have evidence for this? Are we sure that we have evidence for this kind of continuity? I mean, after all, we're warned by the great thinkers, one of which is Francis Bacon here, that this is our habit. We default to this type of reasoning. We default to this type of thinking where everything is of the same kind because of our sense of a need for tidiness, for sameness in everything. So he's sort of warning us against that. He says, if you can, even for the moment, endure the suggested picture of nature, let us now consider the other factor, the reasons or instances of reason which attack her. We have seen that rational thought is not part of the system of nature. Within each man there must be an area, however small, of activity which is outside or independent of her. In relation to nature, rational thought goes on of its own accord, or exists on its own. It does not follow that rational thought exists absolutely on its own. It might be independent of nature by being dependent on something else. For it is not dependence simply, but dependence on the non-rational which undermines the credentials of thought. One man's reason has been led to see things by the aid of another man's reason, and is none the worse for that. It is thus still an open question whether each man's reason exists absolutely on its own, or whether it is the result of some rational cause. In fact, of some other reason. Reason there is spelled with a capital R. That other reason might conceivably be found to depend on a third, and so on. It would not matter how far this process was carried, provided you found reason coming from reason at each stage. It is only when you are asked to believe in reason coming from non-reason that you must cry halt, for if you don't, all thought is discredited. It is therefore obvious that sooner or later you must admit a reason which exists absolutely on its own. The problem is whether you or I can be such a self-existent reason. So Lewis doesn't have a problem here. He doesn't have a problem here with reason being dependent on anything at all. Excuse me, he doesn't have a problem with it being dependent. The problem is with it being dependent on something that's non-rational, right? When it's basically he's saying that if we're asked to believe that reason came from something non-rational, that's when we should have a problem, because we need to be able to see that chain of events that led to the existence of reason was itself rational. Otherwise, reason itself will be discredited. It's when if we're asked to believe that reason came from something reasonable, that it came from reason, that there was reason all the way back, however far you trace the genealogy, if you will, of reason. If there's reason all the way through that, then there's no problem. The moment we're asked to believe that there's a leap from non-reason to reason, that's when we have a problem. That's when reason itself is discredited.
What would make what would make the belief in God not a leap? If we're rolling with that idea.
Well, he's not there yet. We're actually not even talking about God at this point. He's obviously angling towards God at this point, but he's not talking about God at this point. What he's saying is, we live a life where we experience reason. We experience its effects. He gave some examples. You're looking at this book, your own cut fingernails, the building you're sitting in, probably. These things are products of reason, so reason is obviously affecting the universe.
Yeah.
So the question is how to explain that, right? So we have to come up with an argument. We have to come up with a perspective that incorporates the fact that reason occurs, but doesn't ask us to make a leap from, well, it happened because non-rational causes produced it.
Okay.
That won't work for us. We can't accept that. That's what the last chapter was about. It was about the flaw in that sort of thinking. This question almost answers itself the moment we remember what existence on its own means. It means that kind of existence which naturalists attribute to the whole show and supernaturalists attribute to God. For instance, what exists on its own must have existed from all eternity. For if anything else could make it begin to exist, then it would not exist on its own, but because of something else. It must also exist incessantly. That is, it cannot cease to exist and then begin again. For having once ceased to be, it obviously could not recall itself to existence, and if anything else recalled it, it would then be a dependent. Now it is clear that my reason has grown up gradually since my birth, and is interrupted for several hours each night. I therefore cannot be that eternal self-existent reason which neither slumbers nor sleeps. Yet if any thought is valid, such a reason must exist, and must be the source of my own imperfect and intermittent rationality. Human minds, then, are not the only supernatural entities that exist. They do not come from nowhere. Each has come into nature from supernature, which has its taproot in an eternal, self-existent, rational being, whom we call God. Each is an offshoot, or spearhead, or incursion of that supernatural reality into nature. So here, in part, is an answer to the question you were playing at the edges of a moment ago, Adrian. You were saying, well, where is there a
non-leap?
A base for an assertion about God that isn't a leap. Yes, it's here. Lewis is saying, well, our reason, our ability, the fact that this exists at all, and the fact that it cannot be connected to the non-rational series of events that is nature. When we know nature to be a non-rational series of events, we count on it being that. We count on it being something that isn't planned, something that isn't designed. The fact that this thing that we experience on a daily basis, if we're doing it right, cannot be connected with the whole series of non-rational events that we know nature to be, is this indication that we are
dealing with something outside nature.
Dealing with something that is a product of something outside of nature. Yeah, and that ability to reason must be connected to reason all the way back, right? So this is what he was talking about here in the last paragraph. It's got to be connected all the way back to reason as far back as the the story goes. We have to see reason being exercised and being reinforced at every point along the development. It can't be non-reason, 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 reason. We have to see reason all the way back. And this reason, he says, can't be established in any other way. So he says, I can't be this thing. I know this because I was not always in existence. I came into existence. He's sort of, explaining some obvious details about this. He's eliminating the option that he or I or you are the source of this. Something else must be. And tracing this back, Lewis draws it to God, and he's going to explain why he thinks that. He says, yet if any thought is valid, such a reason must exist, and must be the source of my own imperfect and intermittent rationality. Human minds then are not the only supernatural entities that exist. They do not come from nowhere. Each has come into nature from supernature. Each has its taproot in an eternal, self-existent, rational being, whom we call God. Each is an offshoot, or spearhead, or incursion of that supernatural reality into nature. Those are interesting words there: offshoot, spearhead, incursion. In one, you can see that it's like a branch coming off of a tree, an offshoot. In the other, it's like an invading army, a spearhead. Same with incursion. You get that idea of you can almost think of a map where an army is making a breach across another country's borders, or through another army's lines. Some people may here raise the following questions. If reason is sometimes present in my mind and sometimes not, then instead of saying that I am a product of eternal reason, would it not be wiser to say simply that eternal reason itself occasionally works through my organism, leaving me a merely natural being? A wire does not become something other than a wire because an electrical current has passed through it. But to talk thus is, in my opinion, to forget what reasoning is like. It is not an object which knocks against us, nor even a sensation which we feel. Reasoning doesn't happen to us. We do it. Every train of thought is accompanied by what Kant called the I think. The traditional doctrine that I am a creature to whom God has given reason, but who is distinct from God, seems to me much more philosophical than the theory that what appears to be my thinking is only God's thinking through me. On the latter view, it is very difficult to explain what happens when I think correctly, but reach a false conclusion, because I have been misinformed about facts. Why God, who presumably knows the real facts, should be at the pains to think one of his perfectly rational thoughts through a mind in which it is bound to produce error, I do not understand. Nor indeed do I understand why, if all my valid thinking is really God's, he should either himself mistake it for mine, or cause me to mistake it for mine. It seems much more likely that human thought is not God's, but God-kindled. I must hasten, however, to add that this is a book about miracles, not about everything. I am attempting no full doctrine of man, and I am not in the least trying to smuggle in an argument for the immortality of the soul. The earliest Christian documents give a casual and unemphatic assent to the belief that the supernatural part of a man survives the death of the natural organism. But they are very little interested in the matter. What they are intensely interested in is the restoration or resurrection of the whole composite creature by a miraculous divine act. And until we have come to some conclusion about miracles in general, we shall certainly not discuss that. At this stage, the supernatural element in man concerns us solely as evidence that something beyond nature exists. The dignity and destiny of man have, at present, nothing to do with the argument. We are interested in man only because his rationality is the little telltale rift in nature which shows that there is something beyond or behind her. In a pond whose surface was completely covered with scum and floating vegetation, there might be a few water lilies, and you might of course be interested in them for their beauty. But you might also be interested in them because from their structure you could deduce that they had stalks underneath which went down to roots in the bottom. The naturalist thinks that the pond, nature, the great event in space and time, is of an indefinite depth, that there is nothing but water however far you go down. My claim is that some of the things on the surface, i.e. in our own experience, show the contrary. These things, rational minds, reveal, on inspection, that they at least are not floating, but attached by stalks to the bottom. Therefore the pond has a bottom. It is not pond forever. Go deep enough, and you will come to something that is not pond, to mud and earth, and then to rock, and finally the whole bulk of earth and the subterranean fire.
Before we get too far, on page 43, where it starts at why God,
Yeah.
that paragraph wasn't exactly clear.
Right. So there's a system of belief, or a category of belief, I guess it would be better to say, that that says that it's sort of a pantheistic idea, that the idea that sort of God is everything, that God, whenever I'm thinking, whenever I'm moving and whenever I'm acting, that God is acting through me, God is thinking through me, God is being through me, and that I'm not distinct from God, that I'm a piece of God, that my thoughts are a piece of God, and that my thinking is merely an extension of God, right? Lewis is trying to dispel that idea. He's trying to adopt the more traditional belief that I am distinct from God. My thinking is distinct from God. My ability to think is from God, but my thinking itself, when I do it, is distinct from Him. It's mine. And he says, in order to sort of attack that idea that my thinking is just an extension of God, or or is just God thinking through me, he says, and we're back on the end of page 43 here. He says, why God, who presumably knows the real facts, should be at the pains to think one of His perfectly rational thoughts through a mind in which it is bound to produce error, I do not understand. So, if our thinking is merely God thinking through us, why would we make mistakes? Why would we make mistakes? Exactly. Nor indeed do I understand why, if all my valid thinking is really God's, He should either Himself mistake it for mine, or cause me to mistake it for mine. So, why would God at that point want? God at this point becomes a trickster. He becomes someone playing with us. He becomes Loki. This cosmic trickster who's doing the thinking in our minds, whether it be right thinking or wrong thinking, and causing us to think that thinking is ours. So, do you understand that now?
Yes.
Okay. So, back to the end of page 45, he says, at this point it is tempting to try whether naturalism cannot still be saved. I pointed out in chapter 2 that one could remain a naturalist and yet believe in a certain kind of God, a cosmic consciousness to which the whole show somehow gave rise, what we might call an emergent God. Would not an emergent God give us all we need? Is it really necessary to bring in a supernatural God, distinct from and outside the whole interlocked system? Notice, modern reader, how your spirits rise, how much more at home you would feel with an emergent than with a transcendent God, how much less primitive, repugnant, and naif the emergent conception seems to you. For by that, as you will see later, there hangs a tale. But I am afraid it will not do. It is, of course, possible to suppose that when all the atoms of the universe got into a certain relation, which they were bound to get into sooner or later, they would give rise to a universal consciousness. And it might have thoughts, and it might cause those thoughts to pass through our minds. But unfortunately, its own thoughts, on this supposition, would be the product of non-rational causes, and therefore, by the rule, which we use daily, they would have no validity. This cosmic mind would be, just as much as our own minds, the product of mindless nature. We have not escaped from the difficulty. We have only put it a stage further back. The cosmic mind will help us only if we put it at the beginning, if we suppose it to be not the product of the total system, but the basic, original, self-existent fact, which exists in its own right. But to admit that sort of cosmic mind is to admit a God outside nature, a transcendent and supernatural God. This route, which looked like offering an escape, really leads us round again to the place we started from. This is a God, this is the type of God that a lot of people speak of when they speak of God today. When people say, I'm not religious, but I believe in God, this isn't always what they mean, but often it's what they mean. They mean a God that is an emergent God. Lewis uses the word emergent. Emergent because they tend to think of the God they're talking about as a thing, a consciousness, a force that arose, that came about, that was a product of becoming. To sort of use the Marxist terminology, that because the traditional Christian God is a God that's always been, right? He's an eternal God. There was no time that he did not exist. An emergent God is a God that didn't exist at one time but came into being. Now, the God that a lot of people are sort of referencing when they talk that way, and again, it's not everybody who's referencing this kind of God when they talk this way, but oftentimes it is if you sort of question them and drill down into what they're talking about, that the universe is constructed in such a way that once it got into a certain order, once the totality of the mass of atoms that make up all the universe got into such an order, this God was bound to arise. This God, this consciousness, this force was bound to arise. It was bound to come into being, and that's a God that a lot of people can sort of get on board with. But the problem that this God has, as Lewis points out, is the same problem that any explanation for rational thought that is dependent on nature has had up to this point, and that's that the seedbed of it, when we go back far enough, we're asked to believe that non-rationality became rationality, that non-rational events became rational events. And it's at that leap, the jump from one rock to the other, that we have to say, hey, there's a problem here. The non-rational cannot produce the rational. It has to be rational all the way back. So Lewis is saying, well, this seems like it might be a solution at first, but really all it does is just push the problem one stage back. We're not now contending with a nature producing reason. We're contending with nature producing a God, which then produces reason. Right? But it's still nature producing it. It's still the non-rational that's producing it. And this is the problem that Lewis has with it. It isn't a solution, he says. It just pushes the problem one stage back. He continues, there is then a God who is not part of nature, but nothing has yet been said to show that he must have created her. Might God and nature be both self-existent and totally independent of each other? If you thought they were, you would be a dualist, and you would hold a view which I consider manlier and more reasonable than any form of naturalism. You might be many worse things than a dualist, but I do not think dualism is true. There is an enormous difficulty in conceiving two things which simply coexist and have no other relation. Here the two things are God and nature. Do they coexist, but have no relation to each other whatsoever? If this difficulty sometimes escapes our notice, that is because we are the victims of picture thinking. We really imagine them side by side in some kind of space. We imagine God sitting there and nature sitting there, and there's space between them so they don't interact. But of course, if they were both in a common space, or a common time, or in any kind of common medium whatever, they would both be parts of a system, in fact, of a nature. Even if we succeed in eliminating such pictures, the mere fact of our trying to think of them together slurs over the real difficulty because, for that moment anyway, our mind is the common medium. Our mind at that point becomes the common medium, where God and nature as concepts exist in our mind together, and there they interact. If there can be such a thing as sheer otherness, if things can coexist and no more, it is at any rate a conception which my mind cannot form. And in the present instance, it seems specially gratuitous to try to form it. For we already know that God and nature have come into a certain relation. They have, at the very least, a relation, almost in one sense a common frontier, in every human mind. Our ability to reason is the place where they touch each other. At the very least, we know that they interact with each other there. The relations which arise at that frontier are indeed of a most complicated and intimate sort. That spearhead of the supernatural which I call my reason links up with all my natural contents, my sensations, emotions, and the like, so completely that I call the mixture by the single word, me. Again, there is what I have called the unsymmetrical character of the frontier relations. We talked about this earlier, where reason can affect nature, it can colonize nature, but nature can't do anything but destroy reason. When the physical state of the brain dominates my thinking, it produces only disorder. But my brain does not become any less a brain when it is dominated by reason, nor do my emotions and sensations become any the less emotions and sensations. Reason saves and strengthens my whole system, psychological and physical, whereas that whole system, by rebelling against reason, destroys both reason and itself. The military metaphor of a spearhead was apparently ill chosen. The supernatural reason enters my natural being not like a weapon, more like a beam of light, which illuminates, or a principle of organization which unifies and develops. Our whole picture of nature being invaded as if by a foreign enemy was wrong. When we actually examine one of these invasions, it looks much more like the arrival of a king among his own subjects, or a mahout visiting his own elephant. The elephant may run amok, nature may be rebellious, but from observing what happens when nature obeys, it is almost impossible not to conclude that it is her very nature to be a subject. All happens as if she had been designed for that very role.
As if she had been designed for that very role, as if nature was designed by God to keep us on our toes?
No, as if nature was designed to be subject to us, to be put under our control, to be reordered by our reason, and made to serve our purposes. It looks, and he says, he draws an analogy between nature and reason with a mahout and an elephant. A mahout is an Indian elephant driver, and they develop these very close relationships. The elephant and the driver, they know each other their whole lives. Elephants obviously live a long time, and this certain driver is the only one the elephant will obey, will come under the control of. And the elephant is capable of running amok because it's huge and it's powerful. It's capable of destroying a lot of things. It's capable of bringing a great deal of destruction, but under the mahout's control, it is orderly and useful. And he draws this parallel between nature. This is how nature is. It's capable of a great deal of destruction and a great deal of disorder, but under the control of reason, it almost looks like that's what it was made to do. Same with the elephant. It almost looks like that's what it was made to do, to be under the mahout's control. To believe that nature produced God, or even the human mind, is, as we have seen, absurd. To believe that the two are both independently self-existent is impossible. At least the attempt to do so leaves me unable to say that I am thinking of anything at all. It is true that dualism has a certain theological attraction. it seems to make the problem of evil easier. Obviously, it might make the problem of evil easier, because if we say that there are two distinct things in the universe that have no relation to each other, we can say that God is the source of good, and the other thing is the source of evil. We don't have to explain where evil came from with a God who's connected to everything. We'll get to that later. But if we cannot in fact think dualism out to the end, this attractive promise can never be kept. And I think there are better solutions of the problem of evil. There remains then the belief that God created nature. This at once supplies a relation between them and gets rid of the difficulty of sheer otherness. This also fits in with the observed frontier situation in which everything looks as if nature were not resisting an alien invader but rebelling against a lawful sovereign. This, and perhaps this alone, fits in with the fact that nature, though not apparently intelligent, is intelligible. That events in the remotest parts of space appear to obey the laws of rational thought. Even the act of creation itself presents none of the intolerable difficulties which seem to meet us on every other hypothesis. There is in our own human mind something that bears a faint resemblance to it. We can imagine, that is, we can cause to exist the mental pictures of material objects and even human characters and events. We fall short of creation in two ways. In the first place, we can only recombine elements borrowed from the real universe. No one can imagine a new primary color or a sixth sense. In the second place, what we imagine exists only for our own consciousness, though we can, by words, induce other people to build for themselves pictures in their own minds, which may be roughly similar to it. We should have to attribute to God the power both of producing the basic elements, of inventing not only colors, but color itself, the senses themselves, space, time, and matter themselves, and also of imposing what he has invented on created minds. This seems to be no intolerable assumption. It is certainly easier than the idea of God and nature as wholly unrelated entities, and far easier than the idea of nature producing valid thought. So Lewis is trying to has sort of worked at dispelling the thought that nature can produce reason. That's really what chapter 3 was about. He's touched on the ability for nature to maybe produce God, and then that produces reason, this emergent God, and is now trying to dispel that, or has really dispensed with it, and starts to lean very heavily toward the idea that nature and God both exist, and that they are related, that they have a connection, that they are not wholly distinct from each other. We at least know that they are connected in the frontier of every human mind, because reason occurs there. And as he's established earlier in the book, reason has to be connected to reason all the way back. It can't have a non-rational, non-reasonable connection or genealogy. It can't have a non-reasonable history. So the fact that there is something that we call God, of course, he's not really said whether it's the Christian God or not yet. He's just said that there's something that we call God that is the source of this, that is eternal and that is reasonable. That is what seems to make sense to him. And so you instantly you have a picture of two distinct bodies, nature existing and God existing. And Lewis says this idea that they're wholly distinct from each other doesn't seem to resonate when we examine it. And this is what he's dealing with in this paragraph.
You were saying that. What were you saying about evil? You said that if nature and God exist side by side.
Yeah, a dualistic system. This is, people who believe this are called dualists. And yes, dualism seems to, at first glance, provide us with an easier explanation for the source of evil, right? Because we can say, well, the good things come from God. Good, truth, beauty, love, these things come from God, and evil comes from something else, whatever it is. It could be nature in this case, but in that sense, we don't have to we don't run up against the philosophical problem that has plagued many people of trying to explain how God can be good while evil exists. Right? You can ascribe the source of evil to something other than God, because there's two distinct things, right? Nature and God.
Ourselves.
Well, we might participate in it, right? But we may even sort of be missionaries for evil, but we wouldn't have to attribute the existence of evil to God Himself. In that case, that's what dualism seems to offer us. It seems to offer us that possibility. In fact, many religions have been dualistic in this case, or in this way. They've been dualistic because they'll say, well, there were really two creators. Right? One was God, or the God that we think of, and one was some other being who was the source of all evil, and that in this way this allows them, at first glance, to sort of escape the problem of saying God is good, saying God is a lawgiver, an admirer of truth, not an admirer of truth, the source of truth, while also being the source of evil. Because if all things were created by God, all things is really all things, and there's a lot of what we would call evil in the world. So how do we explain this? Dualism seems to offer an escape for that. It seems to offer the ability to say, well, evil came from here and good came from there, and they had no relationship between them. And there's really a war, sort of a cosmic war, if you will. It'd be bigger than a cosmic war, actually, between these two forces, these two elements. So the last paragraph here begins with, I do not maintain that God's creation of nature can be proved as rigorously as God's existence, but it seems to me overwhelmingly probable, so probable that no one who approached the question with an open mind would very seriously entertain any other hypothesis. Right, so, he's saying that the existence of God is easier for him to establish than the fact that God is the creator of nature. Because the existence of God seems easier to establish because our ability to reason seems to speak to that. It seems to say, well, we understand sort of intuitively that our reason cannot come from nature. This is something we've been at pains to talk about pretty much the whole book up to now. So it must come from somewhere else. There is our argument, our establishment of the existence of God. Whatever God is. At this point, whatever God is, He is the source of this ability to reason. Even if He's nothing else at this point in the argument, He's at least that. Establishing that God is the creator of nature is more difficult for Lewis, but he says that anyone who's ever approached this problem with an open mind and intently tried to address it came to the same conclusion. If there is a God, then that God must be the creator of nature. In fact, one seldom meets people who have grasped the existence of a supernatural God and yet deny that He is the creator. All the evidence we have points in that direction, and difficulties spring up on every side if we try to believe otherwise. No philosophical theory which I have yet come across is a radical improvement on the words of Genesis that, in the beginning, God made heaven and earth. I say radical improvement because the story in Genesis, as St. Jerome said long ago, is told in the manner of a popular poet, or, as we should say, in the form of folk tale. But if you compare it with the creation legends of other peoples, with all these delightful absurdities in which giants to be cut up and floods to be dried up are made to exist before creation, the depth and originality of this Hebrew folk tale will soon be apparent. The idea of creation, in the rigorous sense of the word, is there fully grasped. Now, why is he saying this? Most creation legends in other religions, he says they have delightful absurdities. They're pockmarked with these delightful absurdities where when a force or a being goes about to create nature, in order to do this, something has to happen before that, right? The giant has to be cut up, and that giant's body is used to make nature. A river has to be dried up, and that act somehow produces nature. These are he says in Genesis there's a real difference because their creation meaning something from nothing, is there fully grasped. These are very simple words at the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's no thing before it. It's creation, as the theologians will say, ex nihilo, from nothing. Where the creation legends that occur, the other examples of creation legends that we have, there is usually this problem of order, right? Because, okay, the universe is going to be created, but there's something before that. There's something that exists before that. Some material that exists before that we're going to use to create nature. And if so, where did that come from? So you have these, what he calls little delightful absurdities. And he says the Hebrew creation legend is told in the style of a popular poet. This is what St. Jerome said. He says, so, and this shouldn't cause us any problems. We should expect that. It's a Hebrew folk tale. The creation legend is in Genesis, but there the idea of creation, true creation, creation from nothing, ex nihilo, is fully grasped. He says, this is the distinction he draws there. So the next chapter is called A Further Difficulty in Naturalism, and we'll talk about that next time.